On February 16, 2018, the legislature of the Republic of the Marshall Islands, known locally as the ben-ezer, passed the Sovereign Currency Act, which legalized a second legal tender in the Marshall Islands, a new cryptocurrency to be called the SOV. When it's launched, the SOV will be the first internationally traded cryptocurrency ever to be issued by a national government. Is this pioneering move about to launch the Marshall Islands as the world's next major financial center? Hi everybody, I'm Fredo Rockwell, and welcome to the latest installment of Strange Money. This video is about a cryptocurrency, and if, like me, you're a naturally curious person who likes to learn about all sorts of things, and you'd like to know how cryptos work, I'd strongly recommend you buy a copy of this book, Cryptocurrency Investing for Dummies by Kiana Danielle. I read it not to learn about investing so much as to learn crypto basics, what a blockchain is, and that sort of thing. It's an excellent book, and it's perfect for the sorts of people, like me, who like to learn stuff. There's a link in the description. Clicking it will support this channel, so this is technically an advertisement, but it's also a genuine recommendation. Okay, the SOV cryptocurrency is the brainchild of Israeli tech entrepreneur Barak ben-ezer. His idea was to find a sovereign nation willing to issue a new cryptocurrency. The theory is this would remove a major stumbling block from cryptos becoming a mainstream financial instrument. Because they are privately issued, the international financial system in general, and the US government in particular, defines cryptocurrencies as a form of property, not a true currency. If a sovereign government were to issue a cryptocurrency, Mr. Ben-ezer argues, this would legitimize that crypto and allow it to fully integrate into the world economy in ways normal cryptos currently cannot. Or so the theory goes. Of course, finding a country willing to join such a daring project couldn't have been that straightforward. But according to Mr. Ben-ezer, Hilda Hein, the then president of the Marshall Islands, was infatuated with the idea and pushed through the legislation to make the project possible, the Sovereign Currency Act of 2018. You might ask, why would the Marshall Islands, a remote Pacific island nation with a population of less than 60,000 people, be interested in introducing a cryptocurrency as a form of legal tender? Well, here's the case from the Marshall Islands perspective as far as I understand it. The Marshall Islands became independent in 1986, but it has never had its own currency. The US dollar has been the only official legal tender on the islands since they were captured by American forces during World War II. And although the Marshall Islands is technically now an independent country, it remains extremely dependent on the US government in several respects. Most notably, the U.S. provides over $60 million in aid every year, and this makes up the bulk of the Marshallese government's $90 million annual budget. For the Marshall Islands, using the U.S. dollar as its currency has some advantages. It's relatively stable and widely accepted around the world, but there are also some serious disadvantages. One is that the Federal Reserve, the U.S. central bank, runs the dollar to suit the American economy, or at least it tries to, and when it sets interest rates, the Federal Reserve does not for a moment consider what's best for the Marshall Islands. The U.S. government also imposes strict regulations on foreign banks which trade internationally in U.S. dollars as part of its war on terrorism. This is meant to prevent money laundering or money being funneled to terrorists. But with such a small population, the Marshall Islands struggles to keep up with these regulatory demands. As a result, there is currently only one bank in the Marshall Islands which is able to make or receive international payments in dollars. And, reportedly, this lone bank is in danger of losing that privilege. If this were to happen, the Marshall Islands would be unable to make international payments in its only currency, which would be a serious problem. The Marshall Islands could create its own normal currency, what are sometimes called fiat currencies, but creating a new currency is expensive and risky. Not only do you have to pay for a central bank full of regulators, but, if managed badly, the new currency could collapse into a hyperinflationary tailspin, a la Venezuela, and that would be an even bigger problem. So, adopting the SOV as a new currency seems to solve a lot of problems for the Marshall Islands. Unlike standard currencies, cryptos are decentralized and have no central bank to administer them. They can also be transferred internationally without any help from banks and with no service fees. The SOV would also be outside the control of the U.S. authorities, providing the Marshall Islands, after almost 40 years, with its first taste of financial independence. That's the plan, anyway. It's been over 3 years since the ben-ezer passed the Sovereign Currency Act, and news about the SOV has since slowed down to an absolute trickle. So I wrote to the Marshall Islands Finance Ministry for more information, using 2 email addresses provided on their website for inquiries. My email was opened 4 times, but I never got a reply. And a few days after I sent my email, those email addresses I contacted were removed from the website. I could be wrong, but I got the feeling they really didn't want to speak to me. Undaunted, I kept trying and emailed the SOV Foundation, the organization in charge of setting up the SOV, and eventually I got a reply from ben-ezer, the inventor of the SOV himself. This was an unexpected honor, and he was kind enough to let me pester him with questions and gracious enough to answer several of them. So, based on what I've researched online and our email exchange, here is how the SOV, I think, is supposed to work. Initially, 24 million SOVs will be issued. We don't know how much a SOV will be worth yet. That will be determined by market forces, but I've seen projected figures from between $50 to $100 per SOV. At $100 per SOV, that means there will be $2.4 billion worth of SOVs created. Half of the initial SOVs, so 12 million, will be set aside for the Marshallese government and placed in 4 different trust funds, one to support the general government budget, one to help the environment, one to support healthcare, and one fund of 2.4 million SOVs to be distributed equally among the Marshallese people over a 5-year period. If we assume for simplicity that these will be divided equally among all 60,000 inhabitants, that amounts to roughly 40 SOVs per Marshallese citizen, and at $100 each, that's a $4,000 windfall for everyone in the country. This is a significant amount of money anywhere, but especially in the Marshall Islands, where the annual per capita GDP is only $3,800. The remaining 12 million SOVs are to be split 3 ways. 7.2 million are set aside for the foundation, which will administer the SOV and further develop the digital economy in the Marshall Islands. 2.4 million SOVs will be distributed to early investors, and the last 2.4 million SOVs will be given to Mr. Ben-ezer's company as compensation for setting up the SOV. This is potentially a mammoth payout. At $100 per SOV, that would be $240 million. But Mr. Ben-ezer's company is bearing all of the costs for setting up the SOV and will only get compensated if the project succeeds, so I guess fair enough. Once issued, the amount of SOVs in supply will grow automatically by 4% per year, every May 1st at noon. 3% will be given to existing SOV holders, so if you own 100 SOVs at 11:59 a.m. on May 1st, you will find 103 SOVs in your account a minute later, and the remaining 1% will be paid out as fees to miners. Miners are the engine of most cryptocurrencies. Basically, they supply the computers which construct the blockchain, the permanent public record of all crypto transactions, and as a reward they are generally paid with some of the crypto they help run. Once set in motion, the SOV will basically run itself at no cost to the Marshall Islands government. That's what cryptocurrencies are meant to do, of course, so there's no need to pay for a central bank to run it, and with no central bank, SOV owners don't have to worry about the Marshall Islands government issuing more SOVs whenever it wants to and setting off a Zimbabwe-style hyperinflationary crisis. And there's one more essential innovation. In order to own or trade SOVs, whether you're a Marshallese citizen or from somewhere else in the world, you will need a SOV ID. To get one of these, you need to apply to a SOV ID provider who will be responsible for checking your identity and verifying that you are not on a money laundering watch list. Verifiers are also responsible for reporting any suspicious transactions to the authorities. All of this is meant to reassure both governments and the international financial community that, although a cryptocurrency, the SOV can be trusted and won't be used to fund all sorts of terrible things. So the SOV is all tickety-boo, right? It combines the best of both worlds, the international legitimacy and regulatory compliance of a government-backed currency with the swashbuckling appeal and low transaction costs of a cryptocurrency. Plus, if all goes well, the SOV will pump a huge amount of money into the Marshallese economy, right? Well, yes, but there are a lot of unknowns here. There are so many unknowns, in fact, I'm not going to be able to cover them all in this video, but I will try to cover the ones I think are most important. Here goes. The first unknown is whether or not the SOV is actually going ahead or not, and if so, when. In a podcast interview Mr. Ben-Ezer gave in November 2020, he said the projected launch date for the SOV was sometime in 2021. But during our email exchange, when I asked him repeatedly for an update on the launch, he never provided one. In a March 2021 press release issued by the International Monetary Fund, more about them in a moment, they described the Marshallese government's approach to the SOV as, quote, cautious, which makes it sound like this year is unlikely and that maybe the whole project may not even come off, but who knows? Even more questions arise once the SOV launches. How much will it be worth, and will its value be stable? Earlier, I used the figure $100, a figure Mr. Ben-Ezer was quoted using in an interview, but one SOV might be worth less than a penny, or several $1,000s each. No one knows. This is because cryptocurrencies, especially the successful ones, lack stable values. For example, here's the price of Bitcoin since its launch in 2009. It has gained value over time, but it's never been that stable. Its value once increased by 65% in a single day, and on another day it lost 25% of its value. But the overall trend has been upwards, which has, so far, made Bitcoin a good investment. But everyday currencies are not meant to be investments. Everyday currencies are meant to be spent, and to keep roughly consistent value over time. Trying to ensure monetary stability is one of the main jobs of a central bank, and most central banks will intervene in various ways to ensure this. Sometimes this goes really wrong, but in most major economies it sort of works for the most part. Cryptocurrencies lack a central bank to provide stability, so when demand outstrips supply, the price skyrockets. This is how Bitcoin has gone from being worth less than $1 to, as of today, over $45,000. The demand for Bitcoins has grown, and there is no central bank to intervene and keep its value consistent. This means that, as a cryptocurrency, the value of the SOV is unlikely to be stable, and it may increase in value steadily over time. This is great for people who hang on to their SOVs, but if the SOV is going to be a real currency, people need to use it. Would you spend a SOV worth $100 today that might be worth $1,000 next month? Would you agree to your salary being paid in SOVs even though you can't be sure how much a SOV might be worth in 6 months? And if you're the finance minister of the Marshall Islands, would you draft an annual budget in SOVs without any idea whether the SOV will be worth $1 or $1,000 at the end of the year? To be fair, the annual 4% increase in the number of SOVs is meant to help stabilize its value. This plan is based on an idea once propounded by the free market economist Milton Friedman, but it's far from certain that this mechanism will do the trick, or that 4% is the right amount for expanding the number of SOVs each year. But since the SOV is a crypto with no central authority in charge, there will be no way to update or correct this system after launch. To me, this is like getting into a plane that's been put on autopilot and then just hoping it's been pointed in the right direction. So, even if the SOV is successfully launched, a fair amount of price instability seems unavoidable. And that means that, even if retail stores in the Marshall Islands are all set up to accept payments in SOVs, as is planned, and even if the government begins accepting tax payments in SOVs, I suspect most transactions will continue to be priced in dollars. Remember, the dollar is set to remain an official currency in the Marshall Islands alongside the SOV, and if everything remains priced in dollars, then really the dollar remains the actual Marshallese currency, and the SOV just becomes a sort of national crypto side hustle, which may or may not make any money. I'm also not at all sure how the 2.4 million SOVs set aside for the Marshallese people will be distributed fairly. Most of the inhabited islands and atolls which make up the country have less than 1,000 inhabitants each, and often rely on diesel generators for electricity. 20% of the country lives on less than $1 per day, and subsistence farming is still relatively common. As of 2015, the ownership of mobile phones, something pretty much anyone would need to manage a crypto wallet, was still at only about 35%. The challenge ahead for distributing hundreds of millions of dollars worth of cryptocurrencies fairly just seems immense. But let's assume the SOV does successfully and fairly pump billions of dollars into the Marshallese economy. That's good, right? Well, yeah, it sounds good, but huge windfalls of cash can cause a lot of economic distortion, which destroys local industry. The good news is that the Marshallese economy is already pretty distorted by the tens of millions of dollars it receives every year from the US government, and there isn't much local industry left to destroy. So maybe that's okay. But even putting all of these concerns aside, there are still two huge obstacles that a successful launch of the SOV will have to overcome: the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and the US government. Let me explain. The big idea behind the SOV is that it will be a cryptocurrency which, thanks to the support of the Marshall Islands government, can technically be classed as a true currency. And by meeting this technicality, the SOV will be granted access to the global financial system. In all honesty, while this is extremely clever, to me it sounds like a glorified tax loophole. Cryptocurrencies cannot be regulated in the same way normal currencies can, and this is what the US government doesn't like about them, not whether or not they have the blessing of some tiny Pacific island nation, especially a tiny Pacific island nation that the US government itself largely bankrolls. I mean, it's possible that when the SOV is issued, officials at America's Internal Revenue Service will throw up their hands and say, "Hey, they got us. It's issued by the Marshall Islands, so it's a currency and there's nothing we can do about it." But I think it's much more likely that the American government will just redefine what makes a currency in a way that excludes the SOV. That would not be fair, but there wouldn't be a darn thing the Marshall Islands could do about it. The other global financial heavyweight, which is likely to try and hobble the SOV, is the International Monetary Fund, or IMF. This is the international organization with 190 members that monitors the world's monetary system and acts as a lender of last resort for countries that get themselves into an economic jam. We don't need to speculate about the IMF's feelings about the SOV. It has already been made extremely clear. In a March 2021 press release, the IMF wrote that issuing the SOV would, quote, raise risks to the macroeconomic and financial stability of the Marshall Islands. The IMF also doubts that the SOV ID plan will be strong enough to prevent money laundering. I'm no fan of the IMF, but to be fair, the US government's anti-money laundering rules are pretty much impossible even for large banks to implement with 100% accuracy. It's hard to see how a new system overseen by the Marshallese government, which lacks the proficiency to set up its own central bank, remember, will be able to pull this off. And the IMF also warns that if the introduction of the SOV compromises the Marshallese banking sector, that last bank, which is still allowed to transfer US dollars in and out of the country, might be cut off, which would be a pretty serious economic setback for the country. If the US government and the IMF pressured the Marshallese government into dropping the SOV, as I suspect they would, that would not be at all fair. But when it comes to treating the Marshall Islands fairly, the United States has a terrible track record. Between 1946 and 1958, the US government set off 240 megatons worth of nuclear bomb tests on the Marshall Islands. Residents of Bikini Atoll, where many of the bombs were set off, were forcibly evacuated, initially to an island with no food, where they nearly starved to death. One detonation in 1954 of the world's first hydrogen bomb was twice as big as expected, and radiation fallout fell onto populated islands which had not been evacuated in advance. The US government did these horrible things because, 70 years ago, it thought these actions were in its national interest. And if it decides today that eliminating the SOV is in its national interest, do you think it will hesitate to find a way to do it, fair or not? I don't think so. But, in all honesty, I really hope I'm wrong. I hope the SOV somehow succeeds and the Marshall Islands becomes the world's newest financial center, and that there are plenty of jobs and a growing economy and all that good stuff. I think the Marshallese people deserve that if they can get it. I really hope they do. Thanks for watching. Had you heard of the SOV before? And what do you think its chances of success are? And would you buy a SOV as an investment when it launches? Let me know in the comments. And please be sure to like this video, share it with a friend, and subscribe. And I'll see you in the next video.